Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming to my talk today. So before I get started, I want to acknowledge all of my collaborators. The project I work on is a multi-agency project, and I'm really standing on the shoulders of giants that started this project a couple of decades ago. So without them, we wouldn't have the work I'm able to present today. So today I'm going to talk about ecosystem responses to dam removal on the Wind River watershed. So just to orient you to my study site, we're down here in Portland, and just east of us in the Columbia River Gorge, the Wind watershed is the rain-dominated watershed, about 600 square kilometers, mostly under federal landholding. So that means the types of disturbances in the watershed have mostly been forestry-related and then dam construction. The only anadromous species native to the vast majority of the watershed is wild summer steelhead, because of the presence of partial barrier falls at river kilometer 3, and so only steelhead and possibly Pacific lamprey could get upstream of there. Although there is now a hatchery Chinook program as part of the Mitchell Act, so those are up there. And to look a little bit at the habitat, the whole lower main stem of the watershed and the lower ends of the tributaries basically are this high gradient transport reaches, kind of canyon rearing habitat for steelhead. And most of the spawning happens in the upper ends of the tributaries in these low gradient reaches. And these are where land use practices really can kind of make a difference through degrading riparian areas, removing wood. It's where wood kind of has more of an impact. And then the Trout Creek Basin, which is this sub-basin of the watershed, is where Hemlock Dam was located, the dam that I'm going to be talking about today. So kind of going through a little bit of a chronology of the history in the watershed, this is what early logging looks like. And along with early logging, to get the wood out, we had a splash dam in the watershed. So this is a log drive going over Shepherd Falls, that partial barrier. We were very proud of ourselves when we could actually cork off the streams as well. So that's Hemlock Dam right after its completion on Trout Creek, which is one of the major steelhead producing tributaries. And then with the development of the hydro system, we built hatcheries to mitigate. And so not only do we have a Carson hatchery with spring Chinook in the watershed, but we outplanted hatchery steelhead from different watersheds through the mid-90s. And then we have commercial treaty and non-treaty fisheries that intercept steelhead. We have predators that have been changed by the construction of the hydro system, and we have catch-and-release sport fisheries. So this is me inflicting my own pain on the population. And so fortunately for us, a lot of these impacts have been eliminated, and I'm going to talk about the kind of potentially one of the bigger ones in the watershed that has been the focus of our kind of Baki design the last several years in Hemlock Dam. So Hemlock Dam disrupted sediment transport in the Trout Creek subbasin. It reduced the habitat quality in the river and modified the food web. And perhaps most importantly, although there was a fish ladder at Hemlock Dam, it provided very poor fish passage for steelhead, and so kind of potentially limited the ability of them to get upstream and fully feed the habitat. And so basically the Forest Service and BPA and others came together and came up with a plan to remove Hemlock Dam in order to improve fish passage and restore that habitat quality. And it was mechanically deconstructed, and unlike the Elwha or the white salmon, where the sediment was allowed to kind of flush its way out of the system, they actually excavated sediment and put wood in the former reservoir upstream of the dam. So not as much sediment impact to deal with. And this is a photo, sorry it's very dark, I wish that was lighter, but this is looking upstream from the dam only a couple of years ago in the early morning. Basically, there's a whole gallery forest of alders, and it really looks nice in there now, and it's high quality habitat. And so in terms of monitoring, we kind of divide up our monitoring to look at physical habitat and water quality, and then the aquatic invertebrate food web, and then steelhead responses. And I've kind of ordered that in terms of the time scales of monitoring and responses. So I'm going to start, so some of these physical habitat characteristics, these are really occurring in the reach where the dam had disrupted habitat, whereas the fish responses you might expect to be basin scale. And so the first thing is we did long profiles in the former dam footprint in the river, and also did sediment transects to measure substrate size. And basically what we saw is that in the upstream reaches we had cobble before and after dam construction. In the dam breach, we had a sand bottom substrate in the reservoir, and we had kind of coarser substrate downstream of the dam, kind of like what Joe mentioned, where sediment transport has been disrupted. And so following restoration, we saw a switch from sand to cobble in the former dam breach, and so coarsening, and then we saw kind of finer sediment downstream with that sediment transport restored. And then the long profile basically showed that we had erosion in a lot of the reservoir footprint, and then we had some deposition downstream of the reservoir and in a canyon reach downstream. So that's just kind of showing where that sediment went. And then we also had temperature monitoring sites, both in an upstream reference reach above the influence of the dam, within the dam reach, and then below the dam. And so before the dam removal, basically downstream, so if we regress the downstream water temperatures against the upstream temperatures, as you'd expect, downstream is warmer. And then importantly, the daily flux was quite a bit higher upstream, so there's more change day to night in water temperatures. And what we saw after dam removal is that basically the minimum temperatures were almost identical, so there's very little warming during nighttime. During day, you still had higher max temperatures, and I think this is likely to change as that riparian gallery forest continues to grow in the former reservoir footprint. And then I think the biggest change is the daily flux. And basically what this is that at night, instead of having all that stored thermal energy in the reservoir being released downstream, the stream's actually able to cool at night. So that's kind of a big difference in the thermal environment for fish. Then in terms of macroinvertebrates, we did samples in the upper reservoir, lower reservoir, below the dam. And we both characterized species composition and overall densities. And what you saw is that basically in the pre-dam removal years, we had high abundance and high abundance of EPT, which are the mayfly, stonefly, cadfly, important species for salmon foraging in the reference site upstream of the dam. Lower densities downstream of the dam, and basically almost nothing in the reservoir. And within a couple of years after dam removal, you have really similar abundances and abundances of those important species. So looking at this a different way, you can do a multivariate analysis, do some ordination to look at the community structure. And so basically, what I'm showing you here is the below dam site, kind of what the community structure looked like before dam removal. And this is what the community structure looks like in the lower reservoir and the upper reservoir relative to our reference sites upstream of the reservoir. And then, let's see, and then in 2010, what you can see is that the lower and upper reservoir looks very, very similar to our reference site. Below dam isn't quite same, and then by 2011, they basically all look the same. And so we've kind of had the communities converge on a similar aquatic food web to what we would expect in the upstream reference site. So, so then with fish responses, we came up with a bunch of different testable hypotheses. So the first one is basically, a null hypothesis, so we wouldn't see any change in the abundance of adults and smolts. And we had before, after, and before, after control impact study designs with the long-term monitoring that had gone on in the basin since well before the dams were removed. And so we identified treatment and control basins to make those comparisons. We also hypothesized, another null hypothesis we came up with is there'd be no change in kind of the density dependence relationship to the productivity or capacity of the watershed. Trout Creek, I should say. And then I should note that we have limited ability to detect downstream improved habitat effects on fish, simply because our monitoring site was at the location of the former dam, so it's most possible to measure the effects on populations upstream of the former dam site. And then kind of just gets to the question of timing of responses. And so the idea being that because the habitat, well, so even if the habitat had a step change and that happened overnight, because the life histories of these fish take a long time, particularly for steelhead, they can even repeat spawn, and I don't have that on here. The idea is that the timeline for seeing the response in different life stages really varies over time. So while we're now nearly 10 years post-dam removal, we've only had a couple years of data where we kind of have a full generation of fish that have experienced that habitat. And so I think it's useful to keep in mind in terms of setting expectations for responses. So then giving you a sense of how we monitor fish, this is a basin, there's a dam site on Trout Creek. We did adult population monitoring through a mark resite program. So that first involved pit tagging and floy tagging fish at the waterfall in the lower river. And then we could detect a subset of those as they entered the Trout Creek subbasin. And then we basically had to figure out what proportion of the population in the whole watershed as well as in Trout Creek were marked and unmarked by doing a marker capture. So we snorkeled the river to count tagged and untagged fish to give us abundance estimates both in the subbasin and in the whole watershed. And so then that allows us to have a control and treatment site design with basically the Trout Creek subbasin and the whole watershed, the rest of the watershed as the control. And so just looking at the data, I think the first thing you notice is that there's quite a bit of variability over time in the Wind River, and quite a bit of variability in Trout Creek, which implies, kind of having control is going to be important, and having a longer-term data set is going to be important. So you need to be able to control for that variability, and you need to be able to separate that noise out from whatever the signal is. On Trout Creek here, despite all the noise, it does look like we have an increasing trend in abundance, and I've got 3 different colors here because we've used a couple different methods. When we had a dam, we had full census counts in most years, and then after dam removal, when we only had 1 pit tag array, depending on the assumptions you make, you get different answers. And then we had 2 pit tag array sites later, which allowed us to tighten up our estimates of what happened post dam removal. So so we did some power analysis before dam removal to tell us how long might we need to monitor. And the first thing that we figured out was that there was a good correlation between our treatment and control sites. And so using some arbitrary significance values of power, we basically came up with kind of a rough guess that we might need to see an increase of 36 adults after 5 years or 13 adults after 30 years to measure a statistically significant difference. Well, right now we're well above that, but I think in looking at that, one of the reasons you would need that big of a difference or that much time is because of how variable the adult abundance is, and so you saw those changes, those trends in the Wind River abundance during the pre-treatment and post-treatment periods. And I just want to point out, when you have marine survival that's going on in the background for both populations, it's kind of like the 10-mile creek example. You're just all that variability, which is not happening in freshwater, is something you're going to need to control for. So luckily, we did have controls, and these are tentative results. This year, we're going to probably do a more formal analysis and write this up for our first publication post-dam removal. But it's really encouraging. Right now, we've seen a 253% increase in abundance in Trout Creek versus a 24% increase in the Wind Basin, which is an effect size of roughly 200% due to dam removal for adults. But I think looking at how that plays out through the whole life cycle and figuring out whether that's just redistribution is important. And so moving on to smolt, we've also set up a control treatment site design with smolt traps throughout the watershed. And because we have multiple smolt traps, we can divide it into multiple subbasins. And so looking at the smolt data, so looking at the Smolt data first, so these are the 3 tributary subbasins in the upper watershed, and the colors are a little tough to see, but this is Trout Creek and Upper Wind that are kind of following each other here pre-dam removal, and then the wind, Trout Creek is this highest data series, whereas Upper Wind and Panther are lower, and then this is sort of the whole watershed and the canyon that's between these upper Smolt traps, tributary Smolt traps, and the lower main stem site. So the highest data series here is basically the whole watershed abundance. And so given the variability, again, in these, we had done some analyses before dam removal to see how much data we might need. We had correlated treatment and control, at least a good correlation between the Upper Wind and the Trout Creek subbasin. And so post-dam removal, you'll notice that Trout Creek has been kind of consistently high. The Upper Wind, we only had a high year in 2015. So that's kind of showing what might be a dam removal effect. And based on our power analysis, it suggested that with a 25% effect size, we might be able to measure a statistical difference in 8 years. And so now that we're several years out, what it looks like is in Trout Creek, we've had about a 29% increase in smolt production pre versus post dam removal, versus actually declines in the other watersheds. And so that's really encouraging and suggests an effect size of about 20%. But I want to note that at the whole watershed scale, we haven't seen a huge increase for the whole wind watershed. And then so in order to understand smolt production at the whole watershed scale, you need to understand density dependence. And so the next kind of step in our analysis is doing the stock recruit analysis, kind of folding this into the full life cycle and figuring out if, given the number of spawners at the whole watershed level, the change in smolt numbers actually represents an increase. So once you control for spawner abundance, is a decrease in 9% actually a positive change in the production of smolt given the adult abundance. And so we're planning to do that analysis this year. And yeah, we still did a little bit of power analysis for that too. So to summarize, dam removal has resulted in ecosystem responses in the watershed on varying timescales. We saw immediate restoration of fish passage, conversion of lentic to lotic habitat, and the substrate, the aquatic food web, and the temperatures change relatively rapidly. But for fish, it's taking a lot longer due to their life histories and the time, the lags for them to complete those. I think a notable thing here is that because there was passage before the dam removal, I think we all know that when we restore access to habitat that has had no fish, that's going to have an impact. But a lot of partial barriers, they maybe don't get as much prioritization. We don't think they're going to have a big impact. And so I think measuring partial barrier removal, it really looks like could be an important thing for fish. And then I think, doing the power analysis up front and kind of looking at it in hindsight, it really tells us, highlights the importance of good controls and long-term data sets. So with that in mind, I want to thank all my collaborating agencies, our funders, and I think we're doing questions to the group. So.